So this week's Alteryx Weekly challenge was super fun. It's the 200th one and we're trying to solve sudoku problems. In this video, I'll be taking you through the beginner and the intermediate solutions. So for the beginner, we're just taking the string of the grid basically and trying to make it into the classic, more recognisable sudoku format. So we've got an 81 character string here, as you can see. We're just going to split that out into all the different characters. So we're going to split that to rows using the regex tokenize. So we've got 81 rows. That's what we would expect, as a 9x9 grid would have 81 different characters. Then we're going to want to assign a row number and a column number to each of these characters. So we start off by just using a record ID and calling it column, because we're going to use the function modulus. So if you're not familiar with the modulus of something, then basically it means that you can only count up to, but not including that number. So by doing the number in the column mod 9, then that means that we'll always get numbers between 0 and 8. So that means that it will number our column numbers quite effectively. And since it will call the 9s as 0, then I just want to make sure that I call, when the modulus is equal to 0, I'm just going to make sure that I renames it as a 9. And then I've got everything else numbered from 1 to 8. So you can see how that's working. It's just going, it's taking what was, just counting from 1 to 81, and now it's just counting, resetting the count every time you get to 9, if that makes sense. So that's our column numbers there. And then to create the row numbers, we're doing something quite similar. So we're just saying that we want, for each of these 1 to 9 segments, we want them to have a row number basically. So our row starts off with a 0, and we're saying, if the column is greater than the one before it, so if 2 is bigger than 1, then we take the previous row. So that's why initially it starts off by taking a 0, because if the row doesn't exist, then it would be a 0. But then any time that the current row that you're on isn't greater than the one before it, then it's going to add 1 to that. And that's how we get our row numbers. So then all we now need to do is reshape this data and take away the row. And then that's how we get our solution to the beginner section. Great, so that's nice and easy and matching. Now we want to solve it. So we can see that we've only got zeros in this first 3x3 grid. But to help us out with our solution, we're going to create the grid numbers. So, in this select tool, I think we're just reorganizing things. So there's row column, because that makes more sense in my mind to have it like that, but not really a necessary step. But then to create the grid, then we're just going to do a fairly long if statement to create that grid. For the row, I've just added 1 to everything because it was going from 0 to 8 before. Now it's going to go from 1 to 9. It didn't really matter to do it up in the beginner solution because we weren't going to use those row numbers afterwards. But for the sake of my own clarity, I thought it'd be easier to have both the rows and the columns going from 1 to 9. So that's what we're doing up here, just by adding 1 to all the rows. But in the grids, we are just basically saying, for all different possible combinations, we're numbering those grids. So my grids are numbered. The first one would be this top left square here, and then number 2 would be here, 3 here. So it's counting across so that you go from 1 to 9 down here. And that's just what that if statement here is doing. I'll probably copy and paste this so that it's available below for you, so you don't have to write out this if statement if you didn't want to. So that's given us our grid number. Now the logic for how then to solve it is that for each of the digits in our sudoku puzzle, we need to be able to know what's in the row, what other digits are in the row, what other digits are in the column, and what other digits are in the grid that you're in at the moment. And therefore we're going to just create some extra columns to add on to this. So we're grouping by our rows and we're just concatenating all of those digits, doing the same for the columns and for the grids. And then once we've joined these all back together, then you can see that for each of the digits in the Sudoku puzzle, you know exactly what's in the different rows and what's in the different columns and what's in the different, the same column, the same grid, and the same row. And then we can just use some simple kind of string logic by saying, if there are no ones in the row, the column, or the grid, then this cell should be a 1. And that's exactly what I've done here with this long if statement. I know there's definitely a better way to do this, but for this exact solution, this works, this disgustingly long if statement. It's literally just saying, for each of the numbers that there are, just if it doesn't contain a 1 in the row, column, or grid, then it's a 1, and so on and so forth. You can see why this wouldn't work for a whole solution of a Sudoku problem, but for this problem, it does work. And then just to get it to the same solution, we're just concatenating it, first of all, by the row, and then overall, so that it all sticks together in the same way as it stuck together when we started off, by having, each row, and then stuck together like that. So that's how you get to the intermediate solution. Stay tuned for the advanced solution coming up.